Working Cows Podcast, episode 290. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be back with another bonus episode with Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. We are going to talk to them today about the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship and about what we can do to change things up and how we can manage the resources that we have in a way that is responsive to the management that's been there previously and to the different and changing conditions throughout the years that are presented to us, as every year is different. So very excited for this conversation. Very excited to talk about the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. Gabe, Alan, thanks for joining me again on Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Clay.
We have introduced some of these topics over our last couple of episodes together, and today I'd like to take some time and drill down a little bit more on the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. So if you've not listened to previous episodes that we've done together, you can go back and find those in the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/290. workingcows.net/290 is the show notes page for today. You can find the other episodes we've done together listed there, and you can go back and listen to them. But today we're going to drill down on the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and this is one of the 6, the 3 and the 4, the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, still struggling with that one, and the 4 ecosystem processes. So Alan, could you just summarize the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship for us as we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 rules are the rule of compounding, the rule of diversity, and the rule of disruption. And then be very happy to expand on those. But basically, we are the originators of the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. So that originated within Understanding Ag. And honestly, Clay, it comes from our experience. Yeah, they were just things that we kept noting and observing, and just over time, it almost became natural for these 3 rules to just sort of, present themselves, and we've been using them ever since.
So early on in my ministry career, I received some training, and they were talking about where do we start. And one of the things that they always hammered home was that we start with the principles. And I think that these things that we're talking about are principles. They're the base understandings, the things that we are starting with. And then there's practices that get piled on top of those, but the principles are kind of what informs the practices and how we choose what's going to be next. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. This is very similar to the 6 principles of soil health. We have to really deeply understand those before we can appropriately and properly implement the practices. So it's the same way here with the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. We have to really understand these and why we actually even develop these, so that we can then appropriately apply them within our context and in any environment that we may happen to be in.
And you mentioned that you learned about these things through experience. And so would you say that, and that's one of the kind of the features of a rule or a principle, is that it applies everywhere, right? So would you say that these rules, these 3 rules, work in any environment?
Yes, absolutely. We've worked in practically every environment that you can imagine here in the U.S. and in other countries, and And what we have found is that when these three rules are appropriately applied and within context, then they work equally well no matter where you're at. But do let me emphasize, though, that the key is knowing and understanding your context and applying these three rules within that context.
What about with different species? I mean, we talk about sheep and goats and bison, horses, chickens. Is it something that we can apply to different species of livestock as well?
Absolutely. All of us with an understanding ag and many of our clients actually have deep experience with multiple species. And what we have found is that these three rules of adaptive stewardship work equally well, no matter the species. But again, what we have to remember is that each species has its own context. And so we're going to apply those three rules relative to the context of that particular species. But, we've worked with goats and sheep and pastured pigs and obviously cattle, dairy cattle, bison, even water buffalo, horses, poultry, many different species of poultry. And it's really amazing how well each of these species can be used to accomplish the three rules. And I know that Gabe has, a lot of experience with many different species. So I want to ask him to comment on this as well.
Sure, Alan. One of the things that becomes apparent as we stack enterprises with different livestock species is that they all have different grazing habits. They all have their own preferred diet. And that's a beautiful synergy, and one that, quite honestly, more ranchers should be taking advantage of. There's nothing wrong with grazing, for instance, cattle, sheep, and poultry on the same acres. You'll find that now, when stocked appropriately, that you will actually significantly increase net profit per acre while enhancing the ecosystem. That by adding these multiple species, you can more stimulate the latent seed bank and actually increase diversity in many of your paddocks. Now I'm just going to toss it back to Alan because he has a lot of experience in stimulating that latent seed bank. And perhaps we should take a few moments here just to talk about the latent seed bank and how to use livestock as a tool to stimulate that seed.
Well, Gabe, that's a very good point. And in our experience, what we have found is that pretty much anywhere we go, there is still a viable latent seed bank. And what we mean by latent seed bank is a bank of seed and quite a variety of seed or plant species still in our soil. And typically what has happened is through the generations, through the decades, and even through the centuries of agronomic practices, we have created a lot of plated or compacted plate layers in our soil. And what we have discovered is that different types of seed in our seed bank are sort of trapped in these plated layers. And when we utilize various species of livestock through adaptive grazing to be able to stimulate mycorrhizal fungi, aggregate the soil, relieve that compaction, then that releases the seed. The seed is able to then move up through that pore space in the soil so that it can germinate. And there's various methods that it moves up. Water, for instance, moves it up. So as we have rainfall and those types of things, water can float seed up through the pore space of these aggregates. Earthworms and other soil level insects can actually move this seed up as well. And then the pulsing, as we use our livestock under higher density, just that pulsing action of their hooves on the soil pulses the seed up through that aggregate layer, that pore space as well. So this is something that really we have found to be very vital, and it allows us to be able to develop a much, much higher level of diversity than we could ever think about planting successfully.
Yeah.
And at a price point that we can afford, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Native seeds aren't cheap, right?
I know.
So are there scenarios where these different species don't work well together as far as in the same paddock at the same time? And I'm thinking of even like classes of livestock. You run a bunch of yearlings with some first calf heifers, and you're going to have some issues with yearlings trying to nurse on heifers and heifers not being smart enough to say, get out of here, kid, And so, I mean, but like in my own context, I want to run everything I've got together in one paddock: sheep, stocker yearlings, and my horses, because I don't want to throw hay over the fence to the horse if I don't have to in the summertime. So are there scenarios that you've come across where it's like, okay, let's pump the brakes on the diversity in one paddock here for a second, and think about some of those contexts too?
Well, I'll begin, and I certainly want Gabe to comment here too with his experience. So the answer is yes, there are some instances where we have to take into account various considerations. One is, for instance, bison. Okay. You're not going to successfully throw in a bunch of other species with bison. Yeah, you're going to have some problems there. So now, can I potentially do leader follower, things like that? Yes. The other issue is that sheep can carry some diseases that bison have very low immunity to, so we have to be cognizant of that as well in combining sheep and bison. And if I'm going to think about other aspects of how multiple species can help each other and help us break parasite cycles and things like that, then often I'm going to think about, okay, running cattle and sheep first, and then running chickens after them, so the chickens can scratch through the manure pats and eat worm larvae, fly larvae, those types of things, and then pigs after the chickens, so the pigs can do the final cleanup job. And that often does a very good job of breaking that internal and external parasite cycle. Gabe, your experience?
Sure. I'll just give a personal example of one time running species together did not work. So we calve in late May and June, and we have a fairly healthy coyote population on the ranch, which is a good thing. And we decided that we lamb at the same time we calve. We decided we'd mix the cows and the ewes together. Well, we had been running livestock guard dogs with the sheep, of course. Well, we pulled them when we put the ewes in with the cow herd because we knew that wouldn't work. Well, what happened, my son come out there day or two later, and, well, here's a dead lamb. Day or two later, here's another one. Well, we didn't even think that to a cow, those lambs looked like a coyote, and they were actually killing the lambs. Now, if we would have been smart enough, we would have acclimated them together earlier in the season and left them, and then it wouldn't have been a problem. But you have to be aware of things like that. Certainly can't blame the cows. They were doing what they were supposed to do. They were keeping the coyotes away from calves, so that was a good thing. But sometimes you got to learn the lessons the hard way.
Yeah, for sure. So let's take a deeper look at these three rules. We've talked about them, kind of what they are, but let's start with the rule of compounding. Can you give us an example of positive compounding effects?
Yeah, so again, for our listeners' sake, let me start by defining the rule of compounding. And it is just simply this, that there never are any singular effects. In nature, in biology, everything that occurs, every decision we make or don't make, everything we may apply or not apply, all has compounding effects. And these compounding effects are never neutral. They're either positive or negative. So then it really falls on us as the manager, the steward of that land, to make sure that we're doing the observation and the decision making that we need to assure ourselves that we are, in fact, creating positive compounding effects and not negative compounding effects. So now that said, in terms of an example of positive compounding, okay, so if I graze appropriately and I leave plenty of residual behind after that grazing event, then here's the beginning. Clay, we can go as deep as we want to go here, and we can name literally hundreds of compounding effects, but I'll give you some of the top ones, okay? So again, if we graze appropriately, leave plenty of residual after that graze, first of all, we're protecting soil temperature and soil moisture, okay? Secondly, we are leaving plenty of root biomass and root depth behind to continue to support soil microbes and plant function. Third, we are leaving enough plant leaf material behind for adequate photosynthesis to occur and to allow the plant to regrow more rapidly and recover from that grazing event. Next, we're encouraging greater plant species diversity because of the fact that we're leaving residual and we're sort of protecting that seed bank there. By leaving more residual, we're also leaving more habitat for beneficial insects, pollinators, and birds to continue to utilize. If we were to take this down too tight, we haven't done that at all. We've run out the insects, the pollinators, and the birds as well. We also positively impact soil aggregation and water infiltration capacity. We preserve our mycorrhizal fungi and protozoal populations so that water and nutrient cycling can still occur at an optimal rate. And like I said, we could continue to go on there. These compounding effects are so numerous but this is why it's so important.
Yeah.
If we think that, okay, I grazed and I left behind a certain amount and that's all you did, no, you're thinking very incorrectly there. Yeah, again, everything that you do leads to these compounding effects. Now, likewise, okay, so we said we can have positive compounding effects. We can have negative compounding. So let's talk about that. So let's say that we overgrazed instead of grazing appropriately, and we did not leave plenty of residual behind. And let's say that we did that in the middle of the summer and it's turned off a little hot and a little dry. Then here are a number of the negative compounding effects that are going to occur. So first and foremost, we've removed too much of the residual protecting and shading the soil. So now we lose the majority of our soil moisture in the top 3 to 4 inches, and our soil temperature is going to heat up quite a bit. And let me give you a quick example of that. So let's say we've got a 90-degree day in the summertime, and we left plenty of residual. So that soil temperature is still going to be in the 70s to low 80s. However, on that same 90-degree Fahrenheit day, if we overgrazed it, that soil temperature could easily heat up to 120, 130, even 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And when we do that, we are severely damaging our microbial populations. So we've lost soil moisture. We've heated the soil significantly. That is creating die-off of the microbes in the top 3 to 4 inches of soil. We also have had, by overgrazing those plants, we have lost a lot of our root biomass and depth. And what we find, Clay, is that when we allow our livestock to consume more than 50% of plant leaf material in a single grazing event, then if we just go to a 60% graze, for instance, then At 50%, we've only lost 2 to 5% root growth. We call that root growth stoppage. So we have about 2 to 5% root growth stoppage. But if we allow them to graze just another 10% to 60%, that root growth stoppage jumps all the way up to 50%. And then if we take more than that, we actually can have anywhere from 80 to 100% root growth stoppage. Now, what happens when we lose all that root growth? Well, the microbes live in association with the roots. The mycorrhizal fungi live in association with the roots. So now they're losing their habitat and their food source. So they go dormant to protect themselves, and they're no longer working for us. They're no longer building aggregates, infiltrating water, cycling nutrients, all of these other positive things. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, if we graze too severely, then we have destroyed habitat for beneficial insects, for our pollinators, for our birds, and other wildlife. Gabe, anything to add to that?
Instead of adding something, I'm going to spin off and ask you a question here, Alan. You talked about overgrazing. And as you and I and others travel around many different ranches, I think the most common thing we see when we're on farms and ranches is overgrazing, and yet they're understocking. And I think this may be a good point in time when we're talking about compounding and cascading, how both of those are a negative, and they have negative ramifications, negative cascading effects. And I think it's a good point in time to maybe have you explain what is overgrazing and understocking, why do we call it that, and then what are some of those negative effects from it?
Yeah, very, very good question, Gabe, and excellent point. So we do see this very often, and frankly, pretty much anywhere in the world that we go. That this is a core mistake that far too many grazers make. And what Gabe means by that is that if you are doing say a set stock or continuous graze, or even a typical rotation, that type of thing, the livestock are going to almost always overgraze certain areas and undergraze others. And so you're going to see this patchwork through all of your fields and so forth of heavily overgrazed areas and significantly undergrazed areas. And again, this creates a whole host of negative compounding and cascading effects. And what will happen is as they keep returning to the areas that they overgrazed, then they're going to graze them again as that new growth comes in. And they're going to keep overgrazing the same areas typically. And then after about the third or fourth time of doing that, now what you're going to have is what we call weeds, or what a lot of people call weeds, starting to come up, because now nature is saying, wait a minute, I've had too much damage, to this, to my soil, and I've got to grow another type of plant here to repair myself. And so then people wonder why all of a sudden they're getting these weed patches all over their pastures. Well, again, it's because of that overgrazing. And then likewise, where they undergrazed, then the plant species that were there are just going to dominate, and they're going to become old and highly mature and lignified and even oxidized. And so we get this range of negative compounding cascading effects. Whereas if they had just managed their grazing a lot better through adaptive grazing techniques and following the 3 rules, you could have completely avoided those impacts. And another negative impact is this: they will grow far less forage biomass annually. We have a lot of ranchers and grazers that say, no, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. They're on the same acreage, have the same opportunity, no matter how I'm grazing. How in the world am I growing less forage biomass when no matter what my grazing technique? And here's the deal. You're either giving it too much time and it's oxidizing, or you're not giving it enough time to rest and recover from a graze, and you're getting all these weeds in there. So what we have found is that within 2 years, typically, of implementing adaptive grazing from other methodologies of grazing, that it's pretty darn easy to be growing 2 to 3 times the forage biomass that they were growing prior. Gabe?
I certainly agree with that. And it oftentimes is hard for ranchers to understand that, because they drive by and they see those undergrazed areas and they think, oh, I have plenty of forage left. But what they don't understand is that they're having all these negative, has not been grazed.
Yeah, no, very, very good. I appreciate that. And I think that sometimes what we do in those scenarios is think, it's not as productive as it used to be. So the solution is, go find the dealer who's going to sell me something that I can spray on this thing to make it more productive. And really, they sometimes end up, what they're doing is they're treating the symptom rather than the underlying problem. Can you give me some examples of that from your experience?
Absolutely. So, oftentimes that is exactly the case. The vast majority are treating symptoms and not the root cause. And I guess pun intended there. So a few examples here. So let's say that rancher, that grazer, a pasture is not as productive as it used to be. And so they go pull some soil samples, have a standard soil test run, and it comes back, well, I need to apply some NP and K and maybe some lime. So they're, by doing that, by applying the NPK and the lime, they are treating the symptoms and not identifying the root cause of what's really occurring there and solving that. And simply by buying and applying, what's going to happen is they're going to keep doing that. And they're going to create a vicious cycle of reliance on those purchased and applied inputs because they never identified the core problem. And why do the pastures need fertility? Because they haven't been grazing appropriately and allowing the livestock to supply the fertility back to those pastures. The other reason is because they don't have the biological activity in the soil, particularly the mycorrhizal function in the soil, to be able to cycle the nutrients that are already in that soil. They're not getting the root depth that they need to be able to reach nutrients deeper in that soil. And so here we go again with the negative feedback. And a second example of this, treating the symptoms rather than the cause. So if they're finding themselves having to buy and apply fertility, then almost always they also are complaining about my pastures are too weedy. I've got too many weeds out there. So then what do? They go buy and apply herbicides to take care of the weeds. And when in fact, nature is growing very specific weeds at a very specific point in time to try to correct your issues. And instead of recognizing what's really going on there and working with that through our grazing strategy, we just simply go by and apply a herbicide. So we short circuit what nature was trying to do, number one. And then number two, herbicides are never just exactly plant species specific. So we're damaging a lot of different plants in that mix that could be highly beneficial to our livestock. I've also seen this happen with things like armyworms. Oftentimes, if we have armyworm infections in or infestations in our pastures, our fields, almost always it's our fault. We don't have the diversity that we need, and we don't have the plant bricks that we need to ward off those armyworms. So instead, we're going and buying and applying an insecticide. So in all three of those instances, whether they bought and applied fertility, a herbicide, or an insecticide, they are treating the symptoms without identifying that original root cause and addressing that.
Yep. If I may, I will just add another scenario on there. Oftentimes we see producers who they say, oh, I need to go till up that particular pasture because it's sod bound. It's just not productive. Well, really what has happened is that overgrazing that Alan talked about and that constant pruning of the roots to a point where they're not able to access those nutrients. They don't have, the soil does not have the aggregation. We don't have the root depth there. Whereas all they really would have had to do was defer that pasture, let those species have the opportunity to grow. Now realize oftentimes they are stunted, and it may take a growing season or more to get the biomass you need, that then you can come in and properly adaptively graze it, lay that biomass down to where biology and plants can start building aggregates, and you can bring that back to a healthy stand without the tillage and starting all over once you till that. So there's ways to do this, and you're exactly right, Clay. It's about let's solve the problem, not just treat the symptom.
I think I've heard it said that grasshoppers need or prefer bare ground for laying eggs. And so, you could go out and spray for grasshoppers, or you could just have less bare ground and have less favorable habitat for grasshoppers, right?
Yeah.
So, again, that bricks issue that you mentioned with the armyworms, like I think I've heard that with others, that pests tend to be attracted to, like, pests prefer the taste of stressed plants. And so if you have less stressed plants than your neighbor, in a sense, this is one of the great paradigm challenges that I've had over the years on the Working Cows podcast. In a sense, you can fence your place for pests if you have less stressed plants than your neighbor. And so those are some of the things that really kind of blow my mind.
Yeah, Clay, on that specifically, research does show that, first of all plants emit molecules, frequently, pretty much constantly. So they're emitting molecules into the air. And a low bricks plant, which is almost always a stressed plant, emits a very different molecular signal than a healthy high bricks plant. And so you're exactly correct. The vast majority of pests, whether it's armyworms, locusts, grasshoppers, whatever we want to talk about, aphids, they are attracted to the specific molecular signal of a stressed plant. Essentially, they are nature's predators. And just like a wolf, a mountain lion, a tiger, whatever, is going to attack the weak first, that's what these pest insects do. They attack the weak plants first and go after them. So, and we have seen exactly what you're talking about. We have, for instance, our neighbors had typically get armyworm infestations every single summer. But those armyworms will go basically up to our fence line, and we have very, very few armyworms. So our neighbors are out there spraying. We never have to spray. But it's because we've got healthier plants, much higher diversity, higher bricks, and the armyworms are going to stay where they're not threatened. The other thing about these insects, they cannot handle, from a digestive standpoint, high bricks plants. It creates too much alcohol formation in their gut, and it'll kill them. And they know that. So they instinctively stay away from the high bricks plants.
And then on top of that, synthetic fertility, I think what I'm kind of hearing you say is that when we buy and apply synthetic fertility, we're telling that underground root network and the microbes and everything, like, hey, we've got this handled. We don't need you to do the work of producing these and going out and finding these nutrients and bringing them to the plant. And so all of that underground biology gets shut down when we apply synthetic nutrients, because they're like, well, my work here is done. There's an abundance of nitrogen here at the root, and I don't need to go find any and bring it in. Is that Is that an accurate understanding of what's happening there?
Yeah, it's a negative feedback effect. Just like, I think most farmers and ranchers that have livestock understand the physiology of positive and negative feedback. And in our own bodies, obviously, we have positive and negative feedback relative to our endocrine system, our hormone production, and so forth. So it's no different here. If we think of the soil microbes, the soil and the plants as one intact functioning organism, then that organism has physiological positive and negative feedback. And so, as you're saying, if we buy and apply a lot of fertility, the plant is saying, I've got plenty of fertility here. I got plenty of N, or whatever the case may be, and I don't need to produce root exudates to signal the microbes in the soil to feed me in. And so the plant gets lazy. It stops producing and spewing out those root exudates. And then the microbes say, well, wait a minute, you're not feeding me, so I'm not going to go to work to feed you. I need the energy that you're going to feed me from those root exudates, that liquid carbon, to fuel my effort to go find nutrients and feed you. So that whole bartering system just absolutely shuts down. However, on the flip side, if those plants are relying on the microbes in the soil and the fertility in the soil to feed them, then we get a positive feedback mechanism. And the plant, as it's soaking in sunlight and photosynthesizing, knows that it's got to divert a certain amount of that energy to producing root exudates to feed the microbes, so that the microbes will then go pick up the nutrients and feed back to the plants. That's how we want things to function. And that is how we are far more profitable in our operations.
It's back to that thing that you said about the latent seed bank, right? It's there. You don't need to go buy native seeds and plant them. They're there, and the underground microbes are there, and they'll do the work for you if you create an environment that is conducive to them doing that work. Gabe?
Yep. I just want to expand on that a little bit, because in so many areas of the country, it's a common practice to apply synthetic fertility to pastures. And Alan always talks about historical ecological context. And Alan, I'd like you to discuss that a little bit from a nutrient cycle standpoint.
One of the things that we have done, and we've done many of, I don't know how many, but literally thousands and thousands of them, are a test called the Total Nutrient Digestion Test, or TND. And we've done these all over North America, Clay. And what we have found is that it is exceedingly rare for a soil to be truly mineral or nutrient deficient. And the bottom line is this: soils worldwide, okay, were created to have everything that they need. We must have the proper functioning of the microbial population and the plant population for that nutrient cycle and water cycle to work like it should. So when we look at historical ecological context, and that means going back hundreds of years and thousands of years, okay, and examining what kind of plants and insects and animals and so forth were in any particular area. How did they function? How did they live together? What kind of diversity was there in all of those species? And we have to ask ourselves, okay, there was this incredible abundance. Here in North America, there were well over 100 million ruminant species that once roamed this continent, wild ruminants that roamed this continent. And our prairies and grasslands historically would have had far more biomass production on an annual basis 1,000 years ago, even 500 years ago, than the fertilized crops in pasture that we can grow today. We don't even come close, Clay, to the biomass production that used to exist centuries and millennia ago. So who in the heck was fertilizing it then? Who was liming it then? You know, well, the Native American populations weren't doing that. They were relying on the natural resources, and they had no means by which to go out and buy and apply fertilizer or lime. So how in the world did this happen? So when we look at a historical ecological perspective, the way that the wild ruminants moved across that landscape and the disruptions that they created, and we're going to talk about disruptions here in a moment, but the disruptions they created and the tremendous biological shedding and fertility application that they applied back to the soil and their manure and urine, and the tremendous diversity in the diet that they were eating that created far better phytonutrient content in the fertility that they dump back out onto the soil. The soil microbial population itself, Clay, was far, far more robust and vigorous and diverse than in the majority of fields and pastures and rangeland that we have today. So historical ecological context basically shows us that everything is there, it's in place. And if we realize how this world used to function without our input into it, and it thrived without that, how then can we manage today to emulate that, to create that same eco-mimicry and biomimicry response?
Exactly, Alan. And I would just add to that, it was a slow release type of response. It was occurring throughout the growing season. And so it wasn't a copious amount put on at a single point in time where it can run off, get in the watersheds. Plants can't use it all at once. So some of it oxidizes, goes up into the air. Many, many negative cascading effects if we go apply those synthetics.
We could talk about compounding and cascading for the rest of this whole time. I know we could, but I do want to just touch on one more thing before we move on to the rule of disruption, and that is that I don't think that it's an incredibly useful or helpful strategy to scare people away from something. I think it's a better strategy to pitch to them a more positive vision of the future and say, this is what is possible. And I think even Gabe said on one of our first episodes together, that he has never been on a ranch that isn't degraded, including his own. And so to me, that's the attractive part of this. There's a journey of, let's see how many compounding and cascading positive effects we can stack on top of each other, and just see, maybe we can get back to the reality that Lewis and Clark encountered when they came here, and they could tie the grass in knots above their saddle horns on their horses. You know, maybe that's what we want. And so, but it's going to take some time to get there. So just briefly, before we move on to the rule of disruption, can you just pitch the stacking of positive compounding effects to people, and then we'll move on?
Yeah. So, and again, that's why it is important to take time to go back and understand the historical ecological context wherever you may farm or ranch, because if you do that, then you understand the potential that you still have, the potential that is still there. The diversity is still there. The microbes are still there. We just got to re-tap into those resources and regrow and repopulate those resources. And the beautiful thing about this, Clay, is that when we do that, when we are intentional about the application of the 6 principles and the 3 rules, and we maximize the capture of those 4 ecosystem processes, that's about as close to magic as you can get, you know. And I'm saying that as a scientist, a research scientist, okay? But the honest truth is, it really is. And, you know, Gabe will tell you, and I'll tell you, what it took us 20 plus years to achieve. because we didn't know very much at all when we started. Okay. I mean, this was very much by the seat of our pants and, and tons of trial and error. But what it took us 20 or more years to achieve, we can now routinely achieve those same things in 3 years or less. So we've been able to greatly condense the amount of time that it takes to see significant beneficial effects. And Gabe, do you want to talk about, I mean, you've had a journey since the early 1990s, and do you want to address that from your perspective?
Oh, you're exactly right, Alan. As humans, we don't know what we don't know. And I had no idea about the 6 principles, the 3 rules, learned about the 4 ecosystem processes from Alan Savory's writings. But until you actually practice them, and, our partner Shane New has the saying, you have to become intentional. You cannot be intentional-ish. There's oftentimes where a person will ask us, well, I'm going to try a couple of these principles. Well, that's intentional-ish. It's not being intentional. So as you see the rewards, this occurs very quickly. Nature has the ability. Nature is always self-organizing, self-regulating, self-healing. We just have to allow her the opportunity to be so.
Stop picking the scab off.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the other illustration there connected is rip the Band-Aid off and go for it. Don't just dance around the edges. Go for it. And so let's move on, if we may, to the rule of disruption. And on my place, like I said last time we talked about this, when we were just kind of skimming over it, as we're taking a deeper dive here, on my place, maybe next year I'll do the same thing. But so far, every year I've been there, I haven't done the same thing twice. and so I think that's connected to this idea of the rule of disruption, is it not?
Absolutely. The rule of disruption is just simply this, that nature, there is no such thing as stasis in nature, and even in our own lives, right? I mean, Clay, I still get a year older every year, no matter what. And that means I'm aging, my body's aging, everything else, and I'm going to experience that. We have no stasis. Even in personal relationships, we have no stasis. So out there on our farms and our ranches, there is no such thing as stasis. And what we have found is that nature responds incredibly well to challenges. Nature becomes far more resilient when there's challenges. And so by introducing planned, purposeful disruptions, we can have a very positive effect out there on an ongoing basis. And I love to use this analogy. I think I probably used it last time, but I'll remind our listeners, if you've been an athlete, then you know that to continue to make progress, you must alter your exercise routine routinely. If you don't, you're going to stagnate. You're going to hit a wall, and then you're going to start going backwards. So athletes know that inherently. It's the same thing out here on our farms, on our ranches. We must introduce planned, purposeful disruptions. And let me give you a handful. This isn't the all in all list, but it's some of the major disruptions that we can introduce in grazing. And then we can talk about how we can use them. But one is alter stock density. And stock density is very different than stocking rate. Stocking rate is head per acre or acres that it takes per head of livestock. Stock density, however, is the pounds of livestock per acre. And that's what I'm always concerned about, not stocking rate. To me, that's almost irrelevant. I'm far more in tune with and concerned with what are my stock densities. But don't pick a stock density and think that that's the magic, that's the solution, and then stick with that. You've become prescriptive, not disruptive. So intentionally alter or pulse those stock densities. And we do it pretty radically. We'll go anywhere from maybe a low of 20 to 30,000 pounds per acre to over 1 million pounds per acre. Yeah, and then everything in between. Another disruption is alter the rotational pattern. Far too many grazers, when they come out of winter and they got spring green up, they're starting in the same pasture every spring and moving their livestock in the same rotation around their farm every year. So next year, start in an entirely different place for that first graze. A third one is alter the time or season of the year that you may be grazing a particular paddock, pasture, or section of range. Another one is paddock configuration. The shape of the paddock matters. It matters a lot. If I want to get a much higher degree of trample, biological stimulation, and applied fertility, I'm going to build a long, narrow paddock, not a square paddock. So they move differently depending upon the configuration of the paddock. So if I want a higher impact, I'm going to make that paddock long and narrow. Alter paddock direction. If you typically have been making your paddocks east to west, next year, orient them north and south. Alter forage height on and off. Alter rest periods. If you're a management intensive grazer, you rarely do this. You're going on at about the same height, coming off at about the same height, and you have the same rest periods. Month in, month out, year in, year out. And then you wonder why you stop making progress and why your plant species is narrowing rather than widening. So they're losing diversity rather than gaining diversity. They're losing productivity rather than gaining productivity over time. If you're like you are, Clay, and Gabe and myself, we have multiple species of livestock. So another disruption is alter species order from time to time. Alter days in a paddock. So now I don't do this often, but occasionally, just as a disruption, we may build a paddock, and we build it appropriate size, of course, but instead of moving them every day or multiple times a day, sometimes we'll build a paddock and intentionally keep them in that paddock 2 to 3 days. And that is a disruption. But again, you don't want to repeat that and make it prescriptive. Leader follower can be a disruption. So I can move one group, like finishing steers and heifers that I'm grass finishing as my first move, and then immediately follow behind them with my main mob of cows and calves and yearlings. Bale grazing can be a disruption. Planned burns. Now be very careful with planned burning. Too many people overburn or burn too frequently, and this can be very detrimental. So typically, we rarely burn anymore, and most adaptive grazers don't burn a lot. But my advice is don't burn any more often than every 5 to 8 years, any particular acre, if that. Contour grazing is another disruption. It can really help us in moving biology through our landscape. And what I mean by contour grazing is this. So, for instance, I'll use this particular area. We do a lot of work in the sandhills of Nebraska. And down low, they have a lot of wet meadows. But then you go upslope into the sandhills from those wet meadows. So in the wet meadows, there typically is more diversity and more biology and more carbon. So if I'm building my paddocks following the contour first of the wet meadow and grazing that exclusively first, then my next paddock, I'm going to follow that same contour upslope so that I'm moving the biology and the diversity from the wet meadow up the slope, and they'll build my next paddock on the next contour up slope. So I'm moving biology up and up and up from where I have biological hotspots. And then finally, we can do combinations of these disruptions. So as an example, I may alter stock density by increasing significantly my stock density on a particular graze. And to do that, I might also alter my paddock configuration. So let's say that I've typically been building my paddocks more of a square shape, but now that I'm going higher density, I'm going to build them long and narrow, rectangular, so that I can get more of a trample and biological impact and seed stimulation impact. Third, because I did that, I'm going to give that paddock a much longer rest period. So now I have combined 3 different disruptions into a single disruption event: stock density, paddock configuration, rest period.
And I think that it comes back to this idea of being adaptive. What does this land need? Like in my case last year, we didn't bring in any outside cattle, and only about half of our place got exposed to any grazing at all. Now, I made that plan in April, and then it rained in May. And I could have brought in a normal amount of livestock. We grew at least 100% of average forage at our place because of what we got in May and June. And so I could have brought in a normal amount, but I was okay with wasting a bunch of grass because we talked last time about the bare ground from all the years of haying and exporting nutrients and those kinds of things. But this planning your disruptions, and it matches up with this idea of being adaptive. What is happening right now? What kind of response am I going to bring to this as I plan my disruptions? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So each individual disruption, or even combinations of disruptions, must be applied at the appropriate timing and within the appropriate context. So I can actually apply the wrong disruption at the wrong time. And let me give you an example of that. So for instance, at spring green up, I've got things just starting to grow, and I don't have a lot of forage biomass or a lot of forage height yet. So that's not the time to go in with a much higher stock density graze and a long, narrow paddock and all of that, because I don't have what I need to get that trample effect and that stimulation effect that I'm after. And it's actually going to work against me at that point in time. So, it's spring green up, I'm going to look at other things. I'm going to look at, altering the rotational pattern. I'm going to look at altering the time at which I may be in a particular paddock. So if I hit that same area, early last spring, I'm not going to hit it early this spring. I'm going to hit a different area early this spring. I'm going to look at potentially altering my paddock direction at that point in time. So again, you're correct. The particular disruption or group of disruptions needs to be timed appropriately. So if I'm going to go much higher stock density, long, narrow paddocks with longer rest periods, I'm going to wait a little later into my grazing season and let an area that I'm going to do this in grow a lot more biomass. Because one of the key benefits that I get out of this is applying a lot more carbon and growing a lot more organic matter in that soil. So I want as much biomass as I can possibly have to trample. Gabe?
Yep. I would spin off that, Alan, that what Clay just told us he did this past year on his own ranch is a disruption. And I would say that it was an appropriate time for him to allow that forage to grow, because now he's going to be rewarded with many, many positive compounding effects.
Yeah, totally totally agree with that, Gabe. You know, often one of the biggest mistakes that people make coming out of a drought, and again, Clay, you know, there were many areas of the country that were pretty droughty last year, is that as soon as they get some moisture and get growth coming in, then they immediately attack it and overgraze it. And it hasn't recovered from the drought yet. You know, they actually need to give it more time and hold off longer to have a far better benefit. So it's again, that's a common mistake that we see made. And I agree with Gabe too, that it actually was a very good thing that you didn't just run out and buy a whole bunch more cattle and throw them on that excess forage. You will see this year, particularly, you know, you will see more diversity and more total biomass production by having not done that versus what you did do.
Yep. See, Clay, you're much smarter than you even give yourself credit for.
My dad, I'll quote him, "I'd rather be lucky than smart any day." So, but yeah, very good. And I think that obviously these disruptions can be taken too far or can have some negative effects. And I think we've talked about that, but do you have any other examples of disruptions causing negative effects that you'd like to share?
Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, it's almost always our fault if a disruption is taken too far. It's because we failed to observe like we needed to and then move the animals on. So an example of that would be, let's say we do a much higher stock density graze. We alter paddock configuration, but we left them too long. Okay. We didn't move them when we should have. And so they overgrazed it quite a bit. That leaves a lack of soil armor. And that leads to all of the negative compounding cascading effects that we talked about earlier. The loss of soil moisture, the significant rise in soil temperature, the root growth stoppage, the inability of that plant to recover as it needs to because it can't photosynthesize for a while now. We lose the microbial support. We lose soil aggregate collapses. Our water infiltration capacity in that soil decreases and so forth. So we can see a whole host of things like that. Another one is that, again, if I did a much higher stock density with a long, narrow paddock, but I failed to give it enough rest before putting them back in there and regrazing again, I'm going to negatively impact that paddock. So we must combine disruptions with observation. And when you're doing a disruption at that time period, it is absolutely critical that you're also spending time observing.
Yeah, kind of be on alert, right? I know I'm doing something. We're gonna disrupt this system, and so kind of be on higher alert and say, looking for, okay, now we've done enough. Let's go. Kind of that idea.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've talked about the rule of compounding. We've talked about the rule of disruption. Let's move on to the rule of diversity.
So the rule of diversity just simply means this. We want as much diversity as possible. And we want that diversity in a multiplicity of ways. We want diverse plant communities. That's absolutely vital. But we also want diverse soil microbial communities. We want diverse soil macroorganism communities. We want diverse beneficial insect communities and pollinators, diverse bird communities, and so forth. So diversity comes in a host of forms, and we want diversity in all of those forms. That's important because this diversity fuels everything that's going on beneath the soil. It means that we're going to have far better microbial activity, nutrient cycling, water cycling, photosynthetic activity, all of those types of things working for us. it means that we're going to support a far better and broader ecosystem, because now we have habitat for many, many other creatures, not just habitat for our livestock. And to us, that's important. We're not just supporting our livestock, we're supporting a whole world here. And all of these other creatures that are in this world are there for a reason. They're there to benefit us. So we want to make darn sure we're providing the diverse habitat that they need to thrive out there and to stay there and to work for us.
Yeah. And I think this kind of is the field of dreams, right? If you build it, they will come. And he was tearing up a cornfield and putting in a more diverse version. No, I'm just kidding. We won't take the illustration that far, but if you build it, they will come. If you create the habitat for birds and beneficial insects and all these things, they're all going to show up. You don't have to do anything other than create the space for them to thrive. And they, however, I have no idea other than God designed them to be able to communicate and say, hey, there's a good patch of soil over here where we can all thrive together. So it's a pretty cool system, but that is the idea, right? If we build it, they will come, they'll show up, and they'll be there, and they'll do, like you said, they'll go to work for us.
Gabe, have you ever seen the diversity fail to come?
That's a great question. And the truth is, no, it will always come back if we adopt the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. It just cannot fail. We have not seen it fail anywhere on any continent, where there's production agriculture. Diversity will always come back. I think there's many instances where mankind's actions have really degraded ecosystems, and yet if left alone and given a chance, those ecosystems will heal. Now it takes that diversity of microbial, diversity of plants, animals, insects. And the beautiful thing is, as that diversity comes, one thing we haven't talked about much today is there comes the diversity of these phytonutrient compounds that really allow plants to be healthy, animals to be healthy, and then inevitably us as humans to be healthy.
Yeah. Very good. Diversity is the rule, right? And we've talked about kind of why it's so important, but we see a lot of people out there not employing these strategies of diversity. They'll go out and say, we're going to make a hayfield, we're going to plant a monoculture of alfalfa. But, what is that doing to the soils? What is that doing to the animals that are eating it? Can you talk a little bit about the role that diversity actually plays in animal health and in soil health as well?
Absolutely. So monocultures or low diversity, no matter what it is, are going to produce negative compounding effects. The soil and the soil microbes are not going to function as effectively and efficiently as they should. We're going to see far less phytonutrient content. We're going to see lower plant bricks. We're going to see lower animal performance. And there may be a lot of people listening to this podcast and say, no, wait a minute, Alan, lower animal performance. No, I get really good animal performance. Well, if you do, you can get far better animal performance with diversity. Okay. So no, an unacceptable answer is to say you get better animal performance with a monoculture or low diversity than you do with high diversity. That's never the case. You're fooling yourself if you think so, and you have never experienced high diversity. But let's use alfalfa as an example. I can't tell you how many alfalfa fields and pivots of alfalfa we have been on. Many, many, many. And we have stuck the shovel in the ground on every one that we've been on.
If you can get it in the ground.
If you can get it in the ground, exactly. And, it never fails. This soil when you have a monoculture of alfalfa, and this is any legume, okay, but it could be any legume monoculture, but we're talking about alfalfa here, but that soil is going to plate and compact. It's not going to get more aggregated. It's going to plate and compact. You're going to lose microbial function and microbial species diversity. We have poor mycorrhizal function going on. It's not very good at all. So we lose nutrient cycling and water cycling in that soil. And because of all of that, those compounding effects, which are negative compounding, that means that the alfalfa itself is not going to be phytonutrient rich. Now, it may test high in protein, okay, but protein is one of thousands of nutrients and phytonutrients that an animal needs. And when you're only looking at one small component, like crude protein or net energy, you're missing a whole much bigger picture to animal performance and animal health. And we've been measuring these, Clay, with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and working with Dr. Fred Provenza and others, and looking at the vital importance of phytonutrients in these plants. So a monoculture of alfalfa or a monoculture of anything will create a whole cascade of negative compounding effects, including negative impacts on the phytonutrient profile.
And is it enough to say, well, I've got diverse animals, I have diverse plants, so we've talked about the need for diversity in plants, and is it enough to say, well, I've got diverse animals because there's wildlife here, or are we missing out on something by not introducing diverse domesticated livestock species as well?
You know, first of all, wild animals are transient, right? They're there, then they're gone. They're there and they're gone. And depending on whatever, if you have a monoculture or low diversity, they're only there during certain periods. Then they're going to move on because they're not constrained and confined by your fences and all of that. They could care less. They're going to move on to wherever the best feed is at any given point in time. So I'm not getting the same impact at all. And even with that, they're going to favor certain areas within any given field or pivot and ignore others. So it is nowhere near the same impact. Also, I'm going to argue and argue correctly here that you don't have the diversity of wildlife that you could have if you had far more plant species growing out there. And again, we got to talk about what constitutes wildlife here. So it's not just deer, elk, antelope, that type of thing. But we're also talking about a whole host of other mammals. We're talking about a host of birds, insects. All of those things also constitute wildlife that we want to exist and thrive on our land.
Yeah, very good. So we've kind of talked about these three rules. What are the outcomes? If a rancher starts to pay attention to these things and is really working on implementing the three rules of adaptive stewardship, what can they expect to see on their ranch?
So I'll start, and I definitely want to turn this over to Gabe to relate his experiences as well. But the bottom line is this. If ranchers intentionally, not intentional-ish, intentionally apply the three rules of adaptive stewardship, they're going to see significant positive compounding outcomes. They're going to see better soil function. They're going to see better plant species and other species diversity. They are going to see more forage biomass production that's also going to be higher phytonutrient rich, higher bricks. They are going to be able to, over time, increase their overall carrying capacity and support multiple species of livestock. And not the least, this is actually the most important for the vast majority. They are going to significantly increase their net profits. Gabe?
Yeah, all correct, Alan. And all those lead to much greater resiliency of a farm or a ranch. And I would say it leads to opportunity, opportunity to do many other things, incorporate many other enterprises, but also opportunities for the next generation. And, I always ask people, it's so profit driven, yield. I mean, by that, yield driven today, our mentality, yield or pounds. Well, what good is that if we're just producing a lot of yield, we're producing a lot of pounds, but we don't have that net return, and we don't have the ability to bring the next generation into agriculture? And I think there's tremendous opportunities right now for young people getting involved in not only production agriculture, but any type of regenerative agriculture industries, businesses. The other thing I would say is using these adaptive grazing principles really gives you peace of mind. I mean, you're going out there, you're working with God's creation, and there's no better feeling than that. I mean, that's peace of mind, and you know that you're doing it to the best of your abilities, and that's what it was created for.
Yeah, I think that Aldo Leopold said something like, "Our landscapes are a reflection of ourselves." Basically, how do we think about ourselves, and how do we, and so those kind of things are important to how are we viewing the world, and what do we think about the future. And Brian Alexander, I think, shared a pretty powerful story at the end, I think, of our Ag Podcasters Roundtable that we recently did, where he said, he has a neighbor who's become so profitable on his ranch using these principles that now he can afford to farm on fewer acres, and he's opening up some of those other acres that he doesn't need for his younger neighbors to come in and get started. And so you talk about the opportunity that this creates for the next generation, and I think that's a great example of it. And so whether those are your own children, another generation of your own children, or if they're not interested, somebody else's kids who are looking, who are hungry to get started, I think those are some things. And I think we talked about this last time, but I think it deserves being repeated that really these all of these principles and the rules, to me, they come down to an issue of humility. Like, I'm not smart enough to get this system to work by timing all of the right applications and all those things. And so I'm going to approach it with some humility and try to use these principles and these rules, and then allow the diversity to come and allow all of those things to kind of show up on their own as the system begins to become less degraded, as the system begins to be regenerated. I'm going to let those things kind of show up. I'm pretty sure you guys agree with me about the necessity of humility as it relates to these things.
Absolutely.
So one last question. Well, actually two, but one of them is kind of just a jab at Gabe. We'll get there in a second. Is the speed at which these things happen relative to your annual precipitation? The speed at which regeneration can occur, is it relative to your annual precipitation on any level or on some level?
I'll start, and then I'll let Ellen fill in. Building soil and aggregates depends on moisture. However, because you have to have that moisture in the soil to have a healthy biological ecosystem in the soil. But I will never, ever forget what Alejandro Carrillo said when being interviewed about how he has regreened the Chihuahuan Desert, his ranch in the Chihuahuan Desert. And someone was asking him, well, how much precipitation do you get? And he said, well, we get 7 or 8 inches, but I really don't need that much. And so that kind of put it in perspective to me. It revolves, Clay, around your context and where you're at. Up here in Northern Plains, where you and I are at, we don't get an overabundance of precipitation, but we can produce much more than people think possible if we apply the principles and the rules to drive the processes.
And
Alan?
At the end of the day, Alan, before you jump in there, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter how much precipitation you get. It's how much you keep. If it runs off, it doesn't matter.
Well, let me put it this way, Clay. So I live in the deep South, here in the U.S., and was born and raised in the deep South. And I can guarantee you this, that the vast majority of our cattle producers feed as much hay in the winter and for as long a period of time as people up in North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Montana. Okay. So we get a lot more moisture down here. So what in the heck is the problem? It's exactly as you said. It's how much you keep, and it's how you manage that moisture that matters. And you said it earlier about, nature humbling you. And, I have a saying that nature will humble you. And if you refuse to be humbled, nature will defeat you. We never beat nature. So it is far better to think along the lines of stewardship. How do we take what we've been blessed with and steward it so that we can take advantage of what we've been blessed with instead of trying to constantly fight against it and make it outproduce its resources?
Very good. The only thing I was going to say there, Gabe, at the end was you said, just glossed over it. You said coyotes are a good thing. And I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to defend that statement if you wanted to.
Well, I sure can. They are. It's, here I am right adjacent to the city of Bismarck. We have a lot of hunters, and I can't tell you how many come and knock on my door wanting to shoot our coyotes. And I said, why would I do that? And they kind of look at me, why would I allow you to do that? And they look at me funny. And I said, realize if you shoot those coyotes, what's going to happen to the rabbit population, the ground squirrel population? I said, it's all a balance here. And those coyotes aren't harming my livestock. Why not let them live and thrive? They're an important part of the ecosystem.
Somebody's got an equation somewhere for how many rabbits or squirrels equal one cow, right? So they're taking away forage eventually. Where can listeners find more information about all these things?
Sure, they can go to our Understanding Ag website. We have a resource link there that's free of charge. They can view past webinars and past podcasts if they'd like. If they're so inclined, they certainly attend a Soil Health Academy. As a matter of fact, we have several on adaptive grazing this year. One coming up the end of May in New Mexico, another one in Michigan in July, and one in Kansas in September.
Well, and let's add to that, Clay. We also have our online courses, our online curriculum that is a valuable resource to people as well. So the resources that we have on understandingag.com, as Gabe mentioned, our Soil Health Academies, and then our online curriculum, all provide outstanding educational opportunities.
Yep, and we will have links to all that in the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/290, or wherever you're listening to this. You should be able to find below in the description the show notes and go and find those links and make sure that you guys take advantage of those. Gabe, Alan, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Very good stuff, as always, with the Understanding Ag team. Very much looking forward to next week on the Working Cows podcast. We'll be talking with Dr. Larry Trannell. Dr. Trannell is with the Extension Service in Iowa, and he's focused on dairy cows for quite some time, but we are going to be talking to him about something different. We're going to be he spends about half of his time dealing with mental health and farm stress and some of those things, and we're going to talk to him about some of the tools that he has developed and that he's found that work well as far as dealing with the stress that comes with agriculture. And there's a lot of it, honestly, because of the unknowns and the things that we can't change and can't control, and how do we deal with them. So we'll talk to Dr. Larry Tranel about all of that coming up real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.